The first week of February, Sean and I attended a learning conference for UU ministers. We were in San Diego with about 140 other colleagues. San Diego was where the conference was originally scheduled, but then last November, given the ongoing state of the pandemic, they decided to move the conference all online, which meant that about 300 colleagues, maybe a few more, including Reverend Elaine, attended from home and on Zoom. Those of us who still wanted to come to San Diego were basically invited to one big watch party. So I was in San Diego, but the conference was really online, including the morning worship services. They were all online and on Zoom. If you wanted to watch the services with others also in San Diego, there was like a big room, big tent actually, with big screens set up. But then I realized early on that it would mean that you wouldn't have access to the chat, and that actually if I was going to be on Zoom, I'd rather just be in my hotel room and in my PJs having my morning cup of coffee without masks or distancing with the camera off. Maybe you can relate. So there I was in my hotel room and also in a worship service on Zoom that I was really enjoying, when suddenly I heard the leader say, "We're going to pause here and you're all going to spend some time in breakout groups so that we can connect and reflect more fully together." And without even thinking, in that moment, I went, "Ah!" and I hit leave meeting. I was in my hotel room by myself, but I still made that sound. It was a complete impulse. Ah, click. No, I don't want to reflect more fully, or no, I don't want to be seen. No, I do not want to connect more with people more deeply. I just want to sit here passively and semi-anonymously in my protective shell of the Zoom camera off and the microphone muted. I've thought a lot about that moment since, and other moments like it, not because it was rare for me, but because it actually isn't. And it's not just about Zoom. I mean, if I'm in a big lecture and they ask us to turn to someone near us and reflect together more deeply, I have more than once had a sudden need to tend to something out of the room. Despite the fact that I am often the one inviting and encouraging deeper connections and small group reflections, when asked for myself, my auto response is set to, click, leave meeting. I acknowledge I might feel some guilt about this instinct and the basic hypocrisy that it represents, because I know intellectually why this turning towards each other is a really good pedagogical tool, and it's also a vital invitation. We long to be known. We long to know others. It is often the driving force behind all of our actions. We long to be received for our truth, for all of its mess and complexity. We want to be seen by someone who will bear witness and say, "I see that, I see you fully, and I love you still. I love you not in spite of your mess. I love you because of your mess." We long to be known and to be seen whole and holy. Adrian Rich reminds us that being known and knowing others breaks down our self-delusion and isolation. It honors our complexity and it promises us company for the hardest parts of life, that hard way, which we know is a precious and rare gift. But even more important than all of these, being known and knowing others in real and sustained ways is literally life-saving. Or to get at that the opposite way, loneliness, which is what I would describe as a feeling of being unknown and disconnected, has deadly consequences for us individually and collectively. I shared some of this a few weeks ago as we were beginning this series, but it bears repeating. Loneliness significantly increases inflammation, heart disease, and dementia. It's like a 50% greater chance of dementia as your loneliness increases. It significantly increases your risk of premature death from all causes. It's pretty much the equivalent on your health of smoking at least 15 cigarettes a day. It makes it 32% more likely that you'll have a stroke and 57%, and it gives you a 57% increased risk of regular emergency room visits. So set this alongside the recent surveys where over 60% of Americans report feeling persistently lonely, and where 1 in 4 Americans don't feel like anyone knows them. I'm going to say that again. 1 in 4 Americans feels like no one really knows them. Some of you have talked to me about the particular kind of loneliness we hold in our third of life. It is a loneliness that accumulates through a process of losing people we know that have known us, our friends and family year by year, which in turn marks an accumulated process of being known, the loss of being known. For all the ways we talk about the gifts of a long life, we don't really talk about how lonely it can be and how suddenly it can happen. That there is simply no one near us that knows us. The friendships we make as we age are often not as deep or as full as the ones we make earlier in life, as there just isn't that history to hold us in the same ways. The one way that I've seen older adults overcome this is through authentic and deep relationships with people from younger generations, through mentorships or through shared service projects, or maybe even just by being assigned to a random small group together, weeks at a time. These can be surprisingly powerful sites of being known and to know another. Now, for as powerful as these relationships can be for older adults, they are just as needed for younger generations. The most recent surveys show that the younger you are, the lonelier you are. Nearly 80% of Gen Zers and over 70% of millennials describe themselves as lonely. You might think that the internet and the constant process of social networking would help, but as Adam Smiley Pozalski says in his book, Friendship in the Age of Loneliness, social isolation and loneliness are different. It is, you can be very socially connected, yet still be lonely. Social isolation denotes having few connections or interactions, he says, whereas loneliness involves the subjective perception of isolation, the discrepancy between one's desired and actual level of connection. So we can be very networked, yet still feel entirely unknown. And actually that discrepancy of having lots of contacts, but feeling totally unknown can be its own particular kind of pain. And despite what you might think, this does not seem to have actually gotten worse during the pandemic. After reviewing a comprehensive study, Pozwalski reports that social distancing protocols and stay-at-home orders did not actually lead to an increase in loneliness in America. Researchers instead found resilience, not loneliness, as people felt more supported by others than before the pandemic. Even while physically isolated, there was an overall feeling of increased social support and being in this together. He then goes on to describe the various creative ways that we all adapted in the early 2020 pandemic. It is both inspiring and also deflating because of the ways that we know now it has not sustained into these later, less clear, more anxious times of pandemic 2022. My point is, I know all of this. And really, I think we all know all of this. As Adrienne Rich says, we know how much we long to unravel the truth of ourselves and the truth of life. We know it just not just in our minds, we know it in our bodies. And yet I know I'm not the only one who impulsively, when offered opportunities to go past small talk or to spend time with people that we actually want to spend time with, or when invited to meet people who could become new friends, I'm not the only one I know who impulsively, metaphorically or literally hits leave meeting. Author and theologian Jessica Ritchie describes growing up in Denver, where she felt like she knew everyone. When I read that, I was thinking, just imagine if she grew up in Fort Collins or in a small town like what I grew up in, or what I know many of you grew up in. But anyway, she describes growing up in Denver, and she felt like everybody there knew her. It isn't a small town, of course, but she said it felt like one. By the time she was an adult, she was ready to meet people who did not, for example, remember when she danced to Madonna's Like a Prayer in her school talent show, or that time she wrecked her car into a fire hydrant. But then a number of years later, when she had moved away to a new place, she started to realize that while it was fun to play for a while at being anyone, eventually she realized that what she wanted most of all to be was to be known. As she writes, I longed for the comfort of people with whom I could be real in my grief and my heartbreak and my hope. She goes on to tell about adventures on the dating app Tinder, which is one place that people do go to find other humans to be real with, theoretically, except that, as she says, that often what you find there is exactly the opposite. Instead of truths, you find carefully constructed lies of life. Perfectly performed photos and chosen words honed to keep everything true under a protective layer of performed perfection. How are you? What do you do? This weekend looks like nice weather. Many people didn't feel real to her, and some literally were not. Some were bots, Tinder bots, designed to be spectacular at small talk. They were so common and clever that people have had to come up with a quick test, a trick to assess if this new connection they were making was actually a human or a bot. It's a trick test that people have come to know as the potato test. Because bots are clever, but they just cannot replicate the randomness that actual humans offer. As she says, humans go down conversational rabbit holes that make no sense to an algorithm. So when you start to get worried, if you're on this app, you start to get worried that the person that you are talking to is not a person. You write to them, if you're a human, say potato. Bots don't have a programmed response for something so absurd. So literally, they can't say potato when someone randomly asks them to. What exactly constitutes this uniquely human thing that can't be duplicated by artificial intelligence? Richie wonders. Could it be our flaws? Our jokes that don't always land, or our weird hobbies we wonder if anyone else will find entertaining? Is it our silly stories or complicated families? None of us is perfect. And somewhere in these imperfections, we can be found. Now, generally, when we try to explain why we leave meeting instead of choosing deeper connections, we tend to say that we just don't have enough time. We say our lives are too stressful or too busy. Our kids are busy, they keep us busy, or our partners are busy, so we're busy. We're too tired, especially these days in this world today. We're just too tired. But my sense is that more than any of these, we struggle to say yes because we know that revealing a truth of ourselves, being known in real ways, means a willingness to share these things that we don't just not share with others. We tend to also not share them even with ourselves. It means a willingness to say potato to each other. That is, to reveal whatever strange and random truth makes us the particular humans that we are uniquely, and to keep sharing and refining our truths over time through practice and trust building and intention. Being known and knowing others is a process not unlike a spiritual practice, in that it requires both intention and a sustained commitment, a discipline, as Sean would say. And it requires a certain routine, a series of habits that we can study and learn, which is to say, being known doesn't just happen. And it isn't possible just through simple proximity. You can't just hang around people or near people and hope that they get to know you. You can't just post more opinions on Facebook or start a TikTok channel. Although if you do that, please let me know, because I definitely want to follow you. Now, being known actually starts first with the intention of consent. There is no coercion in covenant, and there is no coercion in the practice of being known and knowing others. What I mean to say is you always have permission to leave meeting. I mean that literally here or in any other place where you are invited into deeper conversation and reflection, and I mean it in your life. There is a time to be known, and there is a time for anonymity. But part of this idea of this intention of consent is to say, if you are always choosing anonymity, if you are always avoiding the real, always leaving meeting, always considering the real human connection is a disruption to your life, I mean, the thing that you have to try to fit in between the busyness that is your real life, then this truth that we long for cannot take root. You cannot be known by consistently choosing to be unknown. Secondly, after consent, this practice requires intention in our bodies. It requires checking in with the feelings that arise when we are invited into a conversation of the real and the true. Our bodies seek first safety, and being known is scary and vulnerable, and in a certain way, it is always a little bit unsafe. And so our bodies may first tense up, or turtle, as I've called it. I mean, they might put on our protective shell and go into hiding. My habit of hiding is going into either performance mode or task mode, staying in my head. I mean, to avoid anything resembling saying potato. That's my version. You probably know yours. Now, sometimes this hiding, this protective shell is all you got. It's all you can manage, and that's okay. It's just that, again, this just won't get you there. When we leave behind the weird and the imperfect and the painful parts, we leave behind what makes us human. We leave behind the truth that we long to be known. So the commitment we must make is to practice letting down that protective shell and finding our way towards the real. The body practices that we practice together in worship on Sundays and in some of our small groups is one way into this. You know how it goes. Find your feet on the floor. Feel the weight of your body held in your chair, on the earth. Look to your right. Look to your left. Look behind you. Look for the exits. Breathe deeply and slowly into your belly. Try humming. Put your hand on your heart or your belly and hum. Hum. If you find yourself yawning, that's a good sign that your body is moving towards a posture of settling that is a posture of trust. After you've done this for a while and you're getting to know another person, you might even decide to do some of these things with them before you begin in a given conversation, just to signal to your body that the real can show up just a little more. Now, they say to turn an acquaintance into a close friend, you need to spend in the range of 200 hours together, which, I mean, let's just say that you meet someone an hour a week, which is a lot. That's still years of time. Now, author Kat Vellis, she has some good news for us about this. She says in her book, we should get together. She theorizes that this number is based on faulty research because she says the studies that came to this number included mostly college students with very different life patterns and free time and histories. So she's been working over the last decade to find what she calls fast tracks to intimacy. Velis's feeling is that if we can dedicate ourselves to a certain process of intimacy, what she describes as robust immersion in quality connection marked by vulnerability, self-disclosure, and empathetic listening, we can fast track friendship into existence, which is good news, especially for that promise of making new friends in our older years and the promise of being known and knowing others the whole of our lives. Maybe it's true, Jessica Ritchie writes, that it hurts a little to become real and to risk intimacy with a stranger who might become that friend that we're looking for, or we might be the one that they need at that precise moment. Perhaps it is our job to help one another become more real, one absurd question at a time. So, my dears, if you need that reminder that the way to become known and loved is found not in spite of our flaws, but because of them, say potato. Amen, and blessed be.